The air was thick with dust as Captain Arya Williams' scout ship descended into the war-torn landscape of the desolate planet, Ishtar 9. The world had once been a thriving hub for the Zareth, an advanced alien species. Now, it lay in ruins, cities collapsed, towering spires reduced to rubble. The aftermath of a vicious interstellar war between the Zareth and humanity was still fresh, its scars visible everywhere. Deep in the heart of the galaxy, where few dared to venture, Ishtar 9 was a graveyard for fallen warriors and forgotten civilizations. Arya had been assigned to scout the planet, to search for any remaining hostile forces or hidden weapons. The war against the Zareth had been brutal, and humanity had lost many brave soldiers. But Arya had always been the type to push forward, never backing down from a mission. She maneuvered her ship through the shattered remains of the Zareth city, the once vibrant alien structures now nothing more than half-destroyed skeletons. Her mission was clear: find intel, secure any remaining resources, and get out. As she flew over the wreckage, a faint signal flashed across her radar. It wasn't a human transmission, nor was it the usual energy signatures left by the Zareth's war machines. This signal was weak, almost desperate, yet distinct. Arya's instincts kicked in. She knew she had to investigate. Maybe it was a trap, maybe not, but she couldn't afford to ignore it. The scout ship landed softly on the planet's surface, its engines humming as they powered down. The once glorious city around her was a shadow of its former self. Streets filled with the remnants of the Zareth's alien technology lay in ruin. Arya's boots crunched softly against the ashen ground as she stepped out of her ship, her pulse quickening with anticipation. She was a seasoned soldier, but something about the desolation here unsettled her. She followed the signal to a destroyed building. Inside, the faint glow of an old emergency light flickered weakly in the dark. Arya's heart raced, the quiet eerily unsettling. Every corner could hide danger, but she pressed forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her weapon. A soft sound broke the silence, something small, moving in the shadows. Arya froze, her senses sharpening. She scanned the area, and then, in the debris, she spotted it. A pair of glowing eyes. They stared out from behind a pile of rubble, wide and terrified. Arya's first instinct was to reach for her weapon, but something about the eyes stopped her. The creature was too small, too fragile-looking to be a threat. It wasn't a robot, nor was it one of the Zareth soldiers she had fought in countless battles. This was something different. Something unexpected. Slowly, Arya crouched down, trying not to startle the creature. She spoke softly, her voice steady but filled with the concern she felt. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The alien child, no older than 6 by the looks of her, peered out from behind the wreckage, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She had the unmistakable features of the Zareth: elongated limbs, pale skin, and large, dark eyes. But unlike the Zareth Arya had fought, this one looked lost, vulnerable, and, most striking of all, human-like in her terror. She didn't have the hardened, ruthless expression of a soldier. She was just a child, abandoned in the ruins of her home. The girl's small hands trembled as she slowly reached out toward Arya. She spoke in a soft, alien tongue that Arya didn't understand, but the tone was clear: she was afraid, and she needed help. Arya's heart softened. The sight of the child in such a fragile state pierced through the cold warrior's exterior she had built over the years of battle. She had seen death, destruction, and pain, but she had never seen anything like this before. The Zareth were known for their brutality, their cold, calculating ways. This child was a product of that species, yet she was different. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a soldier. She was just a scared little girl. Arya hesitated, torn between her duty to follow orders and her innate desire to help. The Zareth had shown no mercy to humanity during the war, and yet, here was one of their own, abandoned, weak, and frightened. Was she a trap? A lure to bring Arya into an ambush? She could almost hear the voices of her fellow soldiers in her head, telling her to be cautious, to leave the child behind. But Arya couldn't. Not like this. She slowly extended her hand to the girl, who flinched at first but then, sensing no threat, placed her small, trembling hand in Arya's. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, and Arya could feel the weight of the girl's fear in her grasp. The child's eyes locked with hers, filled with confusion and silent pleading. "All right," Arya said softly, her voice gentle yet firm. "I'll help you. You're safe now." As she stood up, Arya noticed the girl's frailty. Her clothes were torn, and she was emaciated, starving, probably for days. It was clear she had been left here, abandoned by the very species that had once ruled this planet. Arya couldn't imagine what had happened, why the Zareth would cast out one of their own. But there was no time to dwell on that. The girl needed food, shelter, and safety. Arya looked around the ruined city. She knew she had to get the girl back to the ship, but the moment she started to turn, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them. Something was wrong. The sound of engines, alien engines, was growing louder. The Zareth hadn't given up this planet yet, and they wouldn't take kindly to anyone meddling in their territory. The moment of calm shattered. The danger was real. Arya had no choice now but to protect the girl. She had a decision to make, one that would change the course of her mission and possibly the fate of both humans and aliens. Would she risk her life, and the life of her crew, for an abandoned alien child? The first chapter of their journey had begun, and the stakes were higher than Arya could have imagined. As Captain Arya Williams hurried back to her ship with the alien girl, the weight of the decision she had just made pressed heavily on her shoulders. The ground beneath them still trembled from the distant explosions, but Arya's focus was entirely on the child in her arms. Lyra, as Arya had named her, was weak, scared, and clearly on the verge of collapse. Arya couldn't leave her behind, not after seeing the raw fear in her eyes. But as soon as they reached the ship, Arya knew that her decision wasn't going to be without consequences. The crew had already begun preparing for their departure, but when they saw Arya emerge from the ruins holding the young alien, there was an immediate, sharp reaction. Commander Harris, the stern and often uncompromising leader of the human fleet, approached her with a serious look on his face. His sharp eyes scanned the alien girl, and then he fixed his gaze on Arya. "What is this, Captain?" His voice was cold, controlled, but there was an underlying tension. "Is this some sort of enemy trap?" Arya took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "No, sir. She's not a threat. I found her in the ruins. She's just a child, abandoned by her own people. She needs our help." Harris frowned, his brows furrowing in suspicion. "A child? Do you realize what you're saying? That creature is one of the Zareth, the enemy. She could be a weapon, or worse, a biological agent designed to infect us." Arya shook her head, feeling the sting of his words, but she stood firm. "I don't believe that. Look at her. She's terrified and starving. She was left to die in the ruins. There's no way she's a weapon." The commander didn't seem convinced. "We can't risk it. You should have left her there, Arya. The Zareth won't show mercy if they find out we're harboring one of their kind. We need to report this immediately." Arya's heart sank. She knew what that meant. Reporting the girl to their superiors would most likely lead to her being studied, experimented on, or worse, killed. The Zareth had shown no mercy to humanity during the war, and it was doubtful they'd show any now. But Arya couldn't bring herself to turn her back on Lyra. The girl was defenseless. There was no way she could be a threat, she was just a frightened child in need of help. Arya felt an intense pull to protect her, a bond that was already beginning to form, despite the fear and uncertainty that surrounded them. "I'm not going to report her, Commander," Arya said firmly, her voice steady. "I won't hand her over. She's not a threat. Harris's face darkened. This is insubordination, Captain. You're putting us all at risk. Arya's hands tightened around Lyra, who was clinging to her. The alien girl looked up at her with those wide, innocent eyes, and Arya knew, deep down, that she had made the right choice. I'll handle it, sir, Arya said. I'll make sure she doesn't pose any danger. The commander hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting from Arya to the girl in her arms. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. You're walking a fine line, Captain. But if you insist on keeping her here, don't let it jeopardize the mission. We're not running a daycare for aliens. With that, he turned away, leaving Arya standing there, the weight of his words still heavy in the air. But she didn't regret her decision, not yet. That night, while the crew was busy with their duties, Arya took Lyra to a small, quiet corner of the ship. She had already made arrangements to keep the girl hidden from the others. No one else knew about Lyra, not yet. Arya wanted to protect her, to give her the safety and care she deserved. The rest of the crew would never understand, not now, at least. Lyra was lying in a small makeshift bed in a storage room, her eyes closed in exhaustion. Arya had managed to find some food from the supplies, enough to fill the girl's empty stomach. The alien girl ate cautiously, still wary, but she wasn't as frightened as she had been earlier. She seemed to understand that Arya wasn't a threat, though she couldn't communicate fully yet. Arya sat beside her, watching the girl with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She could see the damage that had been done to Lyra's small frame. Her skin was pale and gaunt, her body covered in bruises and scrapes. The Zareth were known for their ruthless ways, but the state of Lyra's condition told Arya everything she needed to know. Lyra had been abandoned, cast aside by her own kind as though she were worthless. Arya gently ran her fingers through the girl's hair. I'm going to take care of you, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if Lyra understood. You're safe now. The girl opened her eyes slowly, her large, dark eyes meeting Arya's. There was so much fear there, but also a flicker of something else, hope. It was a small spark, but it was enough to give Arya strength. Over the next few days, Arya continued to care for Lyra in secret. She provided food, medical aid, and as much comfort as she could offer. She learned that Lyra didn't speak the human language, but there were moments when they could communicate through simple gestures. The alien girl would point to things she wanted, or Arya would show her food and make sure it was something Lyra could eat. One evening, as Arya sat next to Lyra, she realized that the girl was starting to trust her. Lyra's gaze was no longer filled with constant fear. She would smile weakly when Arya offered her food or comfort, and that smile, though faint, was enough to keep Arya going. In the silence of the small room, Arya spoke softly to the girl, a name beginning to form in her mind. Lyra, she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. That's your name now. Lyra. The girl's eyes brightened, and she slowly repeated the name, her voice tiny but clear. Lyra. Arya smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. In that moment, she realized something important. No matter what the others thought, Lyra wasn't just an alien. She was a living, breathing being, someone who deserved compassion and care. And Arya was determined to give that to her, no matter the cost. Arya Williams could feel the weight of the decision she had made pressing down on her, but she had no idea how quickly the consequences would unfold. As days passed on the ship, her actions in taking in the young Zareth girl, Lyra, did not remain a secret for long. The more time passed, the more tension started to build between Arya and her fellow soldiers, many of whom began to openly question her judgment. It started with small whispers, voices murmuring behind closed doors, wondering why she was acting so differently. Arya's decision to protect the alien child, a member of the very species that had slaughtered so many humans, seemed incomprehensible to them. At first, the others kept their doubts to themselves. But soon, they could no longer hold back. It was late one evening when Lieutenant Jackson, a tough and seasoned officer, confronted her. His face was set in a hard expression, his jaw clenched with anger. "Captain," he said in a low, heated tone, "what the hell do you think you're doing? That thing you're keeping around, it's an enemy. The Zareth are a brutal species. You know what they did to us during the war. And yet, here you are, coddling one of them like it's a pet." Arya's gaze hardened, but she kept her voice calm. "She's a child, Jackson. She was abandoned by her own people. She's no threat to us." Jackson's eyes narrowed, disbelief flashing across his face. "A child? You're seriously telling me that? That thing's one of them, Arya. She's the enemy's blood, and you're treating her like a refugee." He shook his head. "You're putting all of us at risk for what? Some misplaced sense of compassion?" The harsh words stung, but Arya refused to let them shake her. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to back down now. "I'm not going to turn my back on someone who needs help. No matter where they come from." Despite her calm response, Arya could feel the eyes of the other soldiers on her, their mistrust growing. Some of them shook their heads, others exchanged uncomfortable glances. The military unit had always been a place where loyalty was valued above all else, and Arya's decision to save an alien child, especially one from the species that had brought so much pain and loss to humanity, felt like a betrayal to many. The real backlash came when Commander Harris himself decided to intervene. He summoned Arya to his quarters, his tone colder than she had ever heard it before. "Captain," Harris began, his voice stern, "I don't know what's gotten into you, but your behavior is endangering everything we've worked for. You've crossed a line." He gestured toward the door where Lyra was being kept, hidden from the rest of the crew. "This alien girl you've taken in. She's nothing but a symbol of weakness. Compassion for the enemy is not something we can afford right now." Arya held her ground. She had expected this, but hearing it from Harris, the man she had worked with for years, hurt more than she had anticipated. "You don't understand, Commander. Lyra is not like the others. She was abandoned. She's just a child." Harris's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "I understand perfectly well, Arya. The Zareth are a threat to humanity's survival. We've been fighting them for years, and you're suggesting we show mercy to one of their kind? That's a mistake, and you're making it." His voice rose, becoming sharper. "The moment we show weakness, we invite retaliation. You know that." Arya could feel the tension between them like an electric current. "I'm not showing weakness. I'm showing humanity." The commander didn't respond at first, but when he did, it was with cold resolve. "This is a war, Captain. We don't have the luxury of showing kindness to our enemies. If you continue with this, I'll have no choice but to report it to command. Your actions are jeopardizing the entire mission. And more importantly, you're putting the lives of every soldier here at risk." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Arya knew the consequences of disobedience in the military. She could be court-martialed, or worse, kicked off the mission and left behind on a hostile planet. But none of that mattered now. She had made a promise to Lyra. She had promised to keep her safe. The following days were filled with tension as the crew grew increasingly divided. A faction of officers, led by Harris, openly criticized Arya's decision. They accused her of being naive, of letting her emotions cloud her judgment. It wasn't just the soldiers who were suspicious of her, the entire atmosphere aboard the ship grew thick with mistrust. Some of the soldiers began to avoid her. They wouldn't speak to her, wouldn't even look her in the eye. A few even started to openly challenge her authority in front of the crew. Their disapproval was becoming louder and more difficult to ignore. Arya had always prided herself on her ability to lead, but this was different. Now, it wasn't just about the mission, it was about proving that she had made the right choice. And the more she fought for Lyra, the more the division grew. Late one night, as Arya sat alone in her quarters, the door to her room opened, and Lieutenant Jackson stepped in. He didn't speak right away, but his gaze fell to the floor, as if he were wrestling with his own emotions. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Arya, you know I'm not going to back you on this, right?" he said quietly. "You're making a huge mistake. The Zareth, they'll never let us go for this." Arya met his eyes. "I don't care about the Zareth. I care about the people on this ship. If we lose our humanity in this war, we lose everything." Jackson hesitated, then nodded, his expression softening just a little. "I don't know if this is going to work out, Arya. But I respect you. Just, think about what you're doing." With that, he left, and Arya was left alone again. But this time, she didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She knew what she had to do. And she wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. Days passed, and Arya continued to care for Lyra, watching as the girl slowly recovered from the physical wounds she had suffered. But there was something about Lyra that Arya couldn't quite understand. Despite her fragile state, Lyra displayed an intelligence that seemed far beyond what Arya expected from a child. The girl was quick to learn, picking up on simple human gestures and even attempting to communicate in ways that Arya found astonishing. At first, Arya thought it was a fluke. Perhaps the alien girl had been exposed to human technology or had seen something similar in the past. But as time went on, it became clear that Lyra's abilities were far more advanced than anything Arya had anticipated. One day, while Arya was sitting beside Lyra, the girl reached for a small device Arya had found among her supplies, a translation tool that could help break the language barrier. It was a basic, rudimentary device, but it was enough to start piecing together a conversation. Lyra pressed a few buttons and then held it up to Arya, her eyes full of curiosity. Arya watched, both amazed and nervous, as the device beeped. A clear voice spoke from it. "I am not like them. I was abandoned." Arya blinked, taken aback by the sudden clarity. "Abandoned?" she repeated, her voice quiet. Lyra nodded, her face serious, and then, in her quiet, almost musical voice, she began to gesture, pointing to herself and then mimicking the act of being left behind. The alien girl slowly began to explain her past, using gestures to help with the translation device. Her words were simple, but their meaning struck Arya to her core. "I was not strong," Lyra said, her voice filled with sadness. "I did not fight. I did not kill. I wanted peace." The words hit Arya like a wave. She had always believed that the Zareth were a brutal, heartless species driven by conquest and power. That belief was unshakable, until now. But Lyra wasn't like them. She wasn't like the Zareth Arya had encountered on the battlefield, merciless and violent. Lyra's words told a different story, one of a child who had been abandoned by her own kind because of her refusal to conform to their brutal ways. As Lyra continued, her words grew more intense. The translation device crackled and beeped, trying to catch up with her thoughts. "They said I was broken. They said I was weak. My parents tried to protect me. But they were too weak. They were not strong enough." Arya could hardly believe what she was hearing. She looked down at Lyra, her heart aching for the girl. The Zareth, a species that prized strength and conquest above all else, had cast aside their own because of something as simple as compassion. The girl before her wasn't a monster, or a warrior, she was a child, just like any human child, trying to survive in a world that rejected her for being different. As the words faded, Lyra's eyes turned distant. The device was silent for a moment, as if processing the complexity of what the girl had said. Then, with a soft, almost sorrowful look, Lyra placed her hand over her chest, as if clutching onto a painful memory. Arya reached out, gently placing her hand on Lyra's shoulder. "You're not broken, Lyra. You're just different. You have the strength to choose kindness, and that's something I admire." But the girl only shook her head, her dark eyes clouded with sadness. She seemed to want to say more, but the words didn't come. Arya could see it in her face, the pain, the fear of rejection. She had been cast aside by the very people she was born to, simply because of her beliefs. That night, when Arya was alone in her quarters, the lights dimmed, and the quiet of the ship settled in, she couldn't stop thinking about Lyra's words. The Zareth had cast aside their own kind because of a difference in values. It was a reminder of the brutality the girl had suffered, and the lengths to which her people would go to destroy anything that didn't fit their idea of strength. The more Arya thought about it, the more she realized that Lyra wasn't the only one who had been abandoned. She, too, was an outcast in some way. After all, she had chosen to save an enemy, a choice that was considered treasonous by her own people. She had turned her back on her own military superiors to protect Lyra, just as Lyra's parents had tried, and failed, to protect her. As the days passed, Lyra's memories began to surface more often. The girl seemed to have bursts of recollections, moments when she would become lost in thought, her eyes unfocused as if revisiting the horrors of her past. Arya, noticing this, decided to help her face it. One evening, as the ship drifted silently through the cold expanse of space, Arya found Lyra in a small, secluded room, staring out a viewport. She was silent, her small hands pressed against the cool glass as she watched the stars. Arya joined her, sitting down beside her. They didn't speak for a long time, but Arya could feel Lyra's tension, a silent ache that seemed to echo through the quiet room. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember, being in the darkness. I remember being alone." Arya gently wrapped her arm around Lyra, offering the kind of comfort the girl had likely never known. Lyra leaned into her, her small body trembling slightly as she allowed herself to be comforted. For a moment, Arya forgot everything, her responsibilities, the war, the tension on the ship. It was just her and this innocent child, a child who had suffered so much but still had the strength to hope. As the days passed, Arya grew more determined than ever to protect Lyra. She wasn't just the enemy's child, she was someone who had been forsaken, who had suffered for choosing peace over violence. Arya knew that Lyra's journey wasn't over, but she also knew that together, they would find a way forward. The story of Lyra's past was only the beginning, and as Arya looked into the girl's eyes, she knew that their bond would grow stronger with each passing day. The road ahead would be filled with danger, but it would also be filled with the possibility of healing, healing for Lyra, and perhaps, healing for Arya as well. The tension aboard the human fleet had been steadily building. While Arya continued to protect Lyra, the division among the crew was growing. Some officers still demanded that Lyra be handed over to the Zareth, while others silently supported Arya's decision. The air was thick with uncertainty, and Arya's resolve was tested daily. But all of that changed the day the Zareth finally struck. It started as a distant rumble, the kind of hum that no one in the military could ignore. Arya was in her quarters when an alert sounded, the harsh tone piercing the silence. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a warning. The Zareth had launched an unexpected attack on the planet's surface, their massive warships descending from the black void of space with terrifying speed. The Zareth fleet appeared without warning, a dark shadow on the horizon of the planet's sky. Their ships were enormous, their sleek, angular forms exuding an aura of menace. Each ship was a harbinger of destruction, armed with weapons capable of obliterating entire cities. Their technology was far more advanced than humanity's, and the sheer power they wielded was unmatched. Arya's stomach twisted as she watched the enemy fleet approach from the observation deck. The Zareth were angry, and they were coming for Lyra. The human military quickly scrambled into action. Commander Harris was among the first to issue orders, barking orders into the comms system as the warships moved closer. He knew this would be a battle unlike any other. The Zareth wouldn't hesitate to annihilate them all if their demands were not met. The message was clear: return Lyra, or face total destruction. "We've got incoming," Harris said to the crew in a tense voice. "Prepare for a full-scale assault. We're not backing down from this." But the problem wasn't just the Zareth fleet. It was the hard choice that now loomed over the humans. If the military refused to surrender Lyra, they would be risking the annihilation of every human on the planet. If they handed her over, they would be surrendering a symbol of humanity's compassion, something that Arya knew was far more important than any battle. It wasn't just about the war. It was about who they were as a species, and what they stood for. Commander Harris, his face grim, turned to Arya. "We need to make a decision, Captain. Now. Do we give her up and save ourselves, or do we risk everything for one child?" Arya's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. She knew what she had to do. "We won't give her up. I won't. We've fought too long, and too hard, to turn away from our humanity now. Lyra is not just a child of the enemy, she's our chance to make things right." The room fell silent. The other officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. Arya's resolve was unwavering. Despite the mounting pressure, despite the clear threat of annihilation, she refused to back down. Lyra had shown them a different side of the Zareth, a side they had never seen before. A side that valued peace. Arya wasn't going to give up on that hope. Not now. "We're not surrendering her," Arya continued, her voice firm. "This is our chance to show the Zareth that we can be more than just a threat to them. We can be better. If we give her up, we've lost more than just a battle, we've lost our chance for peace." The officers in the room were quiet, weighing her words carefully. They knew the risks. They knew the consequences of defying the Zareth. But there was something in Arya's eyes, something that made them pause. For the first time in a long while, they saw a spark of hope in her, a belief that there could be a way forward, even if it meant facing an enemy they could not defeat. Commander Harris finally spoke, his voice quieter but still laced with authority. "This could cost us everything, Captain. Are you ready for that?" Arya nodded. "I am." Outside the ship, the Zareth fleet loomed closer, their weapons charging for an attack. The ships began to fire warning shots, the explosions rocking the ground beneath them. It was clear that the Zareth had no intention of negotiating. They were coming for Lyra, and they wouldn't stop until they got her back. "Prepare for battle," Harris shouted. "Defensive positions. We won't go down without a fight." Arya knew the stakes. The decision had been made. The military would stand their ground. But in the depths of her heart, she knew that this wasn't just about holding their ground against an enemy, it was about holding on to what made them human. Compassion. Hope. The belief that they could do better than just survive, they could learn, they could grow, and they could show the Zareth that even in the face of destruction, they would not give in to hatred. As the enemy's ships circled overhead, the human forces began to prepare for a battle that seemed impossible to win. The odds were overwhelming. The Zareth had weapons that could obliterate entire cities, and the human military was vastly outnumbered. But Arya's heart remained steadfast. She knew they could not let fear dictate their actions. They had to stand tall, and show the Zareth that humanity was more than just a species that fought for survival. Meanwhile, in the medical bay, Lyra watched quietly, her eyes filled with both fear and wonder. She had never seen anything like this before. The sounds of the distant explosions rattled the walls, but she knew that Arya was fighting to protect her. She had come to trust this human, and for the first time in her life, she felt hope. "I won't let them take you," Arya whispered as she knelt beside the girl, her hand gently resting on Lyra's. "We'll get through this. Together." The Zareth fleet was closing in, and time was running out. The next few moments would determine everything. The humans could either stand firm in the face of the enemy, or they could fall. The stakes had never been higher. As the first blasts from the Zareth ships rained down, Arya stood tall, her heart steady, ready to fight for what she believed in. The fight for Lyra, the fight for humanity, and the fight for a future where compassion and peace could triumph over war. The air was thick with tension as the Zareth forces descended upon the human base. The war had shifted in their favor, and they were determined to wipe out humanity once and for all. Their ships rained down fire on the ground, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Buildings crumbled, and the city became a battleground. The human military, already stretched thin, scrambled to mount a defense, but the Zareth were too powerful. The planet was lost, and Arya knew it was only a matter of time before they would be overwhelmed. Arya's heart raced. She had made her decision to protect Lyra, but now that decision was coming to a dangerous crossroads. The Zareth were no longer simply seeking revenge for the girl's escape, they now viewed humanity as a serious threat to their empire. The stakes had never been higher. They couldn't stay here any longer. In the chaos of the siege, Arya and her closest allies scrambled to gather their supplies and make a break for it. Her best friend, Lieutenant Marcus, was by her side. He was a veteran soldier, a man who had been with her through countless battles. His calm, steady presence helped keep Arya grounded as they prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives. "Captain, we need to move now," Marcus urged, his voice firm but urgent. He glanced over his shoulder, watching as the Zareth forces advanced with deadly precision. Arya nodded, her mind focused. "We're heading to the shuttle bay. We'll get Lyra out of here. It's the only way." Lyra, standing beside Arya, seemed eerily calm despite the chaos surrounding them. The young alien girl, once fragile and frightened, had become a silent but steadfast presence. Her eyes darted between Arya and the destruction outside, but there was a quiet determination in her expression. She knew what was at stake, and she trusted Arya with her life. The human soldiers moved swiftly through the base, dodging explosions and enemy fire. The once bustling research facility was now a war zone, its walls crumbling as the Zareth pushed deeper into human territory. Arya's heart raced with every step. They had to move fast if they were going to escape. But the Zareth were relentless. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the enemy forces closed in, their massive war machines and soldiers overwhelming the human defenses. Arya's team moved in tight formation, firing back at the enemy when necessary, but they couldn't afford to stop for long. Every second counted. They reached the shuttle bay, and for a moment, it seemed like they might make it out. The shuttle was ready, its engines humming with power. But just as they started to board, a massive explosion shook the ground, knocking them off their feet. Arya was thrown to the ground, her vision spinning as the world around her erupted in chaos. The shuttle was still there, but the way to it was now blocked by debris and enemy soldiers. "Captain!" Marcus yelled, his voice breaking through the noise. He grabbed Arya's arm and pulled her to her feet. "We have to get to the shuttle now." The group of soldiers rushed toward the ship, but the Zareth forces were closing in, their armored troops storming the bay. Arya's heart hammered in her chest. They were running out of time. Just as they reached the shuttle's entrance, the door closed with a heavy thud. Arya and Marcus made it inside, but several of their soldiers were cut off. The shuttle lifted off the ground, its thrusters igniting just in time to avoid the barrage of fire coming from the ground. Arya watched through the shuttle's viewports as the base continued to crumble. The city they had fought to protect was being torn apart, and they were leaving it behind, with no idea when or if they could ever return. But as they soared into the sky, the threat wasn't over. The Zareth were in hot pursuit, their ships following closely behind. The human fleet had already been overwhelmed, and now it was just them, Arya, Marcus, Lyra, and a handful of soldiers, trying to escape through the vast, hostile galaxy. The enemy was not going to let them go without a fight. The chase was on. The shuttle accelerated, weaving through the narrow gaps between ruined buildings and blasted terrain. Arya gritted her teeth as she pushed the throttle to its limits, trying to shake off their pursuers. The Zareth were fast, and they were relentless. Their ships could easily outpace the small shuttle, and their weapons were far more advanced. But Arya was determined. She wouldn't let them take Lyra. "Stay with me," Arya shouted to the crew, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to get clear of the atmosphere." The shuttle swerved sharply, dodging fire from the Zareth ships. Marcus was at the controls with Arya, coordinating their efforts, while the soldiers manned the weapon stations. Lyra stood quietly in the corner, her eyes closed as though she was deep in concentration. And then, as if on cue, something extraordinary happened. The Zareth forces fired a barrage of energy blasts, targeting the shuttle's engines. The ship lurched, and the alarm sounded, but it didn't go out of control. Instead, the energy blasts flickered and disappeared mid-air, as if they had hit an invisible shield. "What the hell just happened?" Marcus exclaimed, staring at the console in disbelief. Before anyone could react, Lyra stepped forward. She was standing tall, her hands raised as though she was channeling some invisible force. Her eyes were glowing faintly, and her expression was one of intense focus. "Lyra, what did you do?" Arya asked, her voice a mix of awe and confusion. The girl didn't answer with words. Instead, she gestured towards the enemy ships, and suddenly, their weapons stopped functioning. The Zareth ships faltered, their systems glitching as if their very technology had been disabled. Arya watched in stunned silence as the alien girl, in an act of defiance, used her mysterious abilities to cripple the Zareth's advanced weapons systems. The shuttle surged forward, its speed increasing as the enemy ships struggled to recover. For the first time since the chase began, Arya allowed herself a moment of relief. The Zareth were temporarily neutralized, giving them the precious time they needed to escape. But the fight wasn't over. They were still deep in enemy territory, and the Zareth would not stop until they had their revenge. Arya knew that the real battle had just begun. They had to keep running, keep fighting, and above all, keep Lyra safe. As the shuttle sped through the stars, Arya took a deep breath. The chase was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they had a fighting chance. After what felt like an eternity of flight, the shuttle carrying Arya, Lyra, and the remaining crew broke free from the gravitational pull of the war-torn planet. The chaos of battle, the explosions, and the sounds of the Zareth warships had faded into the distance as they soared into the cold expanse of space. The crew was battered and exhausted, but they had made it. They had survived, and against all odds, they had defeated the immediate threat posed by the Zareth. The stars stretched out before them, distant and infinite. Arya stood at the helm, watching the stars glitter beyond the viewports, her heart still racing from the high-stakes escape. Lyra, standing quietly beside her, gazed at the same stars, her wide, innocent eyes reflecting a silent promise of hope. Arya couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph, but it was a bittersweet victory. They had escaped, yes, but the war with the Zareth was far from over. Arya knew that this small victory would not erase the bloodshed that had already taken place. The Zareth would regroup, and they would come for Lyra again. But for now, they had a moment of peace, a rare and precious moment in the middle of a galaxy torn apart by war. The shuttle sensors alerted them to the presence of a nearby human fleet. The fleet had been scattered and overwhelmed by the Zareth, but it was regrouping, and Arya's ship had sent a distress signal ahead. As they docked with the larger vessel, Arya stepped off the shuttle, her heart still heavy. She knew that the crew of this ship might not share her views on Lyra's value. There would be others who believed that the girl, being an alien, was nothing more than a threat. The stakes were still high, and the tension between human soldiers and the alien girl would need to be carefully managed. However, to Arya's surprise, her decision to protect Lyra was met with increasing support. Many soldiers who had fought alongside her on the planet began to see the wisdom in her actions. They recognized that Lyra, despite being an alien, had shown incredible strength and intelligence, qualities that were now being used to help them in their fight for survival. Lyra had already proven that her pacifistic nature could be a powerful ally, and her unexpected abilities had saved them all. Arya's fellow officers, who had once argued against her compassion for Lyra, were beginning to change their minds. Commander Harris, who had been one of her harshest critics, stood beside Arya as they observed the growing support for the alien girl. "I didn't think it was possible," Harris admitted, his voice heavy with reluctant admiration. "I thought you were making a grave mistake by protecting her. But now, it's clear she's more than just a child. She's a symbol of what humanity could be if we dared to look beyond our hatred and fear." Arya nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She, too, had once seen the Zareth as nothing more than a ruthless enemy. But the girl she had saved was a living example of the complexity of life beyond the borders of humanity. Lyra was not an enemy. She was someone who had been cast aside by her own kind, someone who had suffered for her pacifistic nature in a brutal, unforgiving world. She had the potential to change everything, if humanity was willing to embrace her. As the days passed, Lyra became a part of the human crew. Her presence was still met with suspicion from some, but more and more people began to recognize the value she brought. She helped in small ways, using her unique abilities to assist with repairs and offer new insights into alien technology. She was no longer the helpless child they had rescued, she was an ally, a symbol of what could be achieved through understanding and compassion. One evening, as the ship sailed through deep space, Arya found herself on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars. The lights from distant planets and galaxies twinkled in the vastness of space, and for a moment, the weight of the galaxy's problems seemed far away. It was a rare moment of peace, and she allowed herself to savor it. Lyra joined her, standing quietly by her side. The two looked out at the stars, the silence between them comfortable. The young alien girl, once so fragile, now seemed stronger. Arya could see the quiet determination in her eyes, the same determination that had helped them escape the Zareth and survive. "You know," Arya said softly, breaking the silence, "I never thought this would be possible. I didn't think I'd ever see the day when humans and aliens could work together." Lyra turned her gaze toward Arya, and for the first time, there was a spark of something more in her eyes, hope. "I don't know if it's going to be easy," Arya continued, her voice thoughtful. "But I think you've shown us something important. Maybe there's a way for our two species to coexist. If we can learn to trust each other. If we can look past our differences." Lyra gave a small nod, as if she understood. She looked back at the stars, her expression serene, as if she could see a future, one where both humans and aliens could live in peace. The war between humanity and the Zareth was far from over, and Arya knew that many battles still lay ahead. The Zareth would not simply forget their defeat. But as she stood there with Lyra, looking out at the stars, a quiet hope stirred in her heart. There was a possibility, a faint glimmer, that one day, their two species might find a way to live in peace. It would be a long and difficult road, but it was a road worth walking. As Arya turned to walk away from the observation deck, Lyra's small hand reached out, gently resting on her arm. Arya looked down at the girl, and Lyra's eyes met hers. It was a silent promise, a promise that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together, united in the hope that, one day, compassion might be the bridge that would unite their worlds. In that moment, Arya knew that the future held endless possibilities, possibilities where humanity's greatest strength wasn't in its technology or its weapons, but in its ability to show compassion, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The stars stretched out before them, and for the first time in a long while, Arya felt a flicker of true hope.